Priest cancels wedding and declares, "I cannot allow this union." The reason surprised everyone. Hello, welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The golden hues of dawn spread across the rolling hills of Florence, where the cobblestone streets still held the coolness of the early morning. The city awakened to the distant chime of church bells and the aroma of freshly baked bread drifting through the narrow alleys. At the heart of this picturesque scene, the majestic Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore stood tall, its stained-glass windows glowing like precious jewels under the first rays of sunlight. Inside a small adjoining room of the cathedral, Father Paul Victor Charles adjusted his white clerical collar with calm, deliberate movements. His fingers traced the fabric slowly, almost as if each gesture was a silent prayer. He stared into the mirror longer than usual that morning, his eyes reflecting a quiet unease. It was a feeling he couldn't quite explain, but it lingered, subtle yet persistent. Taking a deep breath, he sought the comfort of the sacred words he had spoken countless times before. This was a special day, not just for the city, which often hosted grand wedding ceremonies for prominent families, but also for him. There was something unique about the marriage of Sarah Nelson and John Benjamin Reed. From the moment he first met them, Father Paul had sensed a rare sincerity, especially in Sarah. Her voice carried warmth as she spoke about her love for John. She shared stories of their travels together, the love letters they exchanged in the early days of their relationship, and how every Thursday, without fail, John would send her flowers, no matter how far apart they were. Acts of love like that were rare, and Father Paul had seen enough unions to recognize when love was real. As he walked through the cathedral's grand nave, his eyes lingered on the carefully arranged decorations. Rows of white lilies lined the central aisle, their soft fragrance filling the air with a subtle sweetness. The altar stood at the end, adorned with delicate cream-colored roses and an imposing wooden cross at its center, a powerful symbol of purity and truth. Father Paul stopped for a moment, his gaze fixed on the cross. A sudden chill ran down his spine, not from the cold, but from a sensation that gripped him from within. It was as if a silent call had echoed in his heart, urging him to pay attention. He stepped forward, his fingers brushing the polished wood of the altar, feeling its smooth, solid surface beneath his touch. Closing his eyes, he whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, let only true love touch this altar. If something must be revealed, make me your instrument." The silence that followed was profound, but instead of peace, a strange weight settled on his heart. His eyes opened slowly, his gaze locking on the aisle that Sarah would soon walk down in her white wedding gown. She would walk it with joy, hope, and trust. But for the first time, Father Paul felt the unsettling thought that perhaps all was not as it seemed. Later that morning, as he drove toward the cathedral, the familiar route unfolded before him. The winding road passed through rolling green hills, the gentle rustle of olive trees blending with the breeze that blew through his open car window. This drive had always been a source of peace for him. The curves of the road, the break in the trees that revealed the distant skyline of Florence, it was a path that never failed to ease his mind. But not today. Just ahead, on a sharp bend, a flash of metallic blue caught his eye. A luxury car, sleek and unmistakable, was parked on the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. It was a Maserati, its deep blue paint glistening like a sapphire under the sun. Father Paul immediately recognized it. It was John Benjamin Reed's car. His brows furrowed in confusion. Cars like that didn't stop for no reason. Without hesitation, he slowed down and pulled over a few meters ahead. Looking in his rearview mirror, he saw movement. A figure outside the passenger door. At first, he thought it might be a mechanic or a driver in need of help. But as he watched, something felt off. A woman stood by the open passenger door, leaning partially inside the car. Her movements were casual, familiar, not like someone assisting with an emergency. Father Paul squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He stepped out of his car, pretending to check his tires as a way to discreetly get a better look. Slowly, He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes now able to see more clearly. The woman leaned in, her body angled toward someone inside the car. For a brief moment, Father Paul saw John Benjamin Reed's face. He was laughing. Not nervously. Not awkwardly. It was a light, carefree laugh. Father Paul's breath caught in his throat. He knew that laugh. He had seen John laugh like that in the cathedral, in front of Sarah, in front of the world. But this wasn't the place for it. This wasn't a moment of joy shared with his bride-to-be. This was something else entirely. His gaze moved to the woman. Her hair fell over her shoulders in loose curls, her hands resting on the edge of the car seat. Then, it happened. John reached out and placed his hand over hers. Not a friendly gesture. Not a handshake. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Their fingers intertwined for just a moment. Father Paul felt his chest tighten. It wasn't anger, but disappointment, a deep, cutting disappointment that dug into his soul. He could still see Sarah's smile in his mind, bright and full of hope, like the sun breaking through the stained glass windows of the cathedral. He turned away, walking back to his car with slow, heavy steps. His heart felt burdened, his thoughts swirling in turmoil. He didn't confront them. He didn't call out. He simply got back into his car, closed the door, and sat there for a moment in absolute silence. The world around him seemed muted, like someone had lowered the volume on life itself. With both hands on the steering wheel, Father Paul stared at the road ahead. His mind replayed the image of John and the woman, the clasp of their hands, his laughter, the sense of betrayal. He could not unsee it. The road felt longer now. The journey back to the cathedral was not the same peaceful drive he had made earlier. The trees swayed, but their rhythm seemed heavier. The skyline of Florence appeared distant and unreachable. As he parked his car near the church, he sat for a moment, eyes closed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He took a long breath, then exhaled slowly, his mind burdened with doubt and duty. He walked into the cathedral with slow, steady steps. His gaze lifted to the altar, the very altar where, in a few hours, John and Sarah would stand. His fingers brushed the wooden surface once more. It was solid, unyielding, strong. Just like the truth should be. The chill returned, but this time, it wasn't fear. It was certainty. Father Paul stood before the cross, his gaze steady, his heart firm. The altar was sacred. The truth had to be told. Father Paul stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the wooden cross before him. The weight of the decision pressed on his chest like a stone too heavy to lift. His fingers lingered on the smooth surface of the altar, tracing the grain of the wood as if searching for an answer hidden in its texture. He knew what he had seen. John Benjamin Reed's hand over Julia Elizabeth Farrow's, the intimate touch, the shared laughter. It wasn't the behavior of a man hours away from marrying the love of his life. Father Paul had witnessed many unions during his time as a priest, and in all those years, he had learned to recognize the signs of doubt, fear, and hesitation. But this was something else entirely. This was betrayal. He inhaled deeply, the cool air filling his lungs. His heart was heavy, but his mind was clear. The altar was sacred. The vows exchanged in front of it were sacred. He could not, in good conscience, allow a union built on lies to take place. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed behind him, light but purposeful. He turned slowly, his hands clasped in front of him. It was one of the altar boys, a young boy named Marco, no older than 12. "Father Paul, the bride has arrived," Marco announced with a grin, his voice tinged with excitement. "She looks beautiful." Paul forced a soft smile, nodding. "Thank you, Marco. Go and make sure everything is ready for the procession." The boy nodded eagerly and rushed back toward the entrance. Paul remained still, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the large cathedral doors. Sarah was here. Minutes later, the large wooden doors swung open with a gentle creak, letting in the soft light of the morning sun. The guests turned their heads in unison, the rustling of clothes and murmurs filling the air. Sarah Nelson stepped inside, radiant as ever. Her wedding gown shimmered like fresh snow under the glow of stained glass windows. The lace sleeves hugged her arms, and the train of her dress flowed behind her like a river of silk. Her hair was styled in soft waves, adorned with small pearls that gleamed with every step she took. Her smile was as bright as ever, full of hope, full of love. She lifted her gaze to the altar and met Father Paul's eyes. She gave him a small, excited nod, as if to say, "We're finally here." Paul felt his throat tighten. For a moment, he considered speaking to her in private, taking her aside, telling her everything. But how? How could he destroy her happiness so suddenly? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of another arrival. John Benjamin Reed had entered through a side door. He walked with confidence, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, every movement deliberate and precise. His smile was sharp, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the admiration of the guests. He glanced at Sarah, his gaze softening, and then he looked away, as if the moment wasn't important enough to hold his attention for too long. But Father Paul noticed it. The subtle shift in John's expression. A flash of something, cold. Indifference? Calculation? He wasn't sure. But it was enough. John approached Sarah, leaned in, and kissed her lightly on the cheek. "You look stunning, love," he whispered, his voice smooth like velvet. "Thank you," Sarah replied, her eyes shining with love. "I was starting to think you'd be late." "Me? Never," John said with a grin, his eyes darting briefly toward the back of the church. It was so quick that most wouldn't have noticed. But Father Paul did. His gaze followed John's, and that's when he saw her. Julia Elizabeth Farrow, one of Sarah's bridesmaids, stood near the second row of pews, pretending to adjust her dress. She wasn't looking at Sarah. She wasn't even looking at John. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her lips pressed into a tight line. Guilt has a way of making people small. Father Paul had seen that look before. His chest grew tight again. His fingers curled into fists behind his back. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was certainty. She knew. He knew. And neither of them had the courage to stop it. He stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "Sarah, may I have a word with you before the ceremony begins?" Her eyes flickered with curiosity but no suspicion. "Of course, Father. Is everything all right?" "It's just a small matter," he said, his smile kind but strained. "It won't take long." John's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching briefly. He glanced at Sarah, then at Paul. "She's a little busy right now, Father. Can't it wait?" Paul tilted his head slightly, eyes unwavering. "No, it cannot." There was a pause. John's grin remained, but his eyes hardened. He stepped aside, raising his hands in mock surrender. "By all means, Father." Paul led Sarah to the side, away from the watchful eyes of the guests. Her smile remained, though her brows knitted with slight concern. "Is something wrong, Father Paul?" she asked softly, her voice like a gentle breeze. He stared at her for a moment, longer than he should have, searching for the right words. He saw the love in her eyes, the hope, the dream of a future she had built in her heart. "How do you shatter something so delicate?" "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice lower than a whisper, "I need you to listen carefully to me." Her smile faded. "What is it?" "Sometimes," he began, his tone steady but filled with gravity, "the truth comes to us at the most inconvenient moments. It's not always clear, and it's rarely kind. But as your priest, it is my duty to protect this altar, and you, from any form of deceit." Her face grew serious. "Father Paul, what are you trying to say?" His gaze softened with compassion, but his resolve remained firm. "On my way here," he said slowly, "I saw John on the road. He was not alone." Sarah blinked, processing his words. "He wasn't alone." "No," Paul replied, his voice unwavering. "He was with Julia." Her lips parted, her breath caught in her chest. Her eyes darted to the side as if searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything that might make sense of what she had just heard. That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head. "Julia is one of my bridesmaids. She would never." "Sometimes, betrayal comes from where we least expect it," Paul said gently. "I tell you this not to ruin your day, but to give you a choice. The altar before you is sacred. Your vows will be sacred. But you must be certain that the man you choose to stand beside you is worthy of them." Her breathing grew shallow. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she covered her mouth with a trembling hand. No, he wouldn't do that to me. I saw them, Sarah." Her shoulders shook. The pain hit her like a tidal wave, crashing over her so violently that she had to hold on to the edge of the pew to stay on her feet. Her breathing became sharp and uneven. Her tears fell freely now, and her fingers dug into the fabric of her gown. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking like glass. "No." Father Paul reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm but comforting. "Take your time, Sarah. No one can make this decision for you." For a moment, she didn't move. Her gaze was distant, her eyes full of disbelief. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her tear-streaked face shifted. Her eyes, once filled with doubt, now brimmed with something stronger. Resolve. Her breathing steadied. Her back straightened. She wiped her tears away, careful not to ruin her makeup, and nodded. Her eyes met Father Paul's, and this time, they were clear. "Thank you, Father," she said softly, her voice no longer trembling. "I know what I have to do." Father Paul watched her walk back toward the center of the cathedral. Her steps were slower but purposeful. His gaze flickered toward John. John smiled, oblivious to what was coming. But Father Paul knew. The altar was still sacred, and soon, it would bear witness to something far more powerful than vows. It would bear witness to the truth. Sarah stood at the center of the cathedral, her back straight, her eyes sharp like shards of glass. Her gaze flickered between John and Julia, the two people she had trusted most. Her breathing was steady, but her heart was a storm of crashing waves. The soft murmur of the guests echoed around her like distant thunder. People smiled, whispered, and adjusted their seats, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was about to shift. The string quartet played a soft, elegant melody, filling the air with an illusion of serenity. But Father Paul knew that peace was an illusion. John approached her, his confident smile firmly in place, his every step filled with certainty. He reached for her hands, his fingers lightly brushing hers. But she didn't take them. Her hands remained at her sides, rigid as stone. "Everything okay, love?" John asked, tilting his head, his eyes scanning her face with feigned concern. Sarah blinked slowly, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her voice was calm, but her words were sharp enough to draw blood. "Are you sure you want to do this, John?" Her tone wasn't sweet or playful. It was steady, cold. A knife wrapped in silk. John's brows lifted in surprise. "What kind of question is that?" "Of course, I do." He let out a short laugh, glancing around as if searching for support from the crowd. "You're just nervous, Sarah. It's normal. Weddings do that to people." Her eyes narrowed, and her gaze darted briefly to Julia, who stood among the other bridesmaids. Julia's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles turning white. She wasn't looking at Sarah. In fact, she was looking anywhere but at Sarah. "I'm not nervous, John," Sarah said, her voice louder this time. Her words echoed off the cathedral walls. Slowly, she turned her body to face the guests. Her eyes scanned each face, friends, family, strangers, all here to witness a moment of love. They would witness something else instead. Her breath was calm now. Her voice no longer trembled. She lifted her chin, each movement deliberate, like a queen preparing to pass judgment. "I'm going to ask a question," she said, her voice clear, commanding. The quartet stopped playing, the silence that followed was deafening. "And I want every single person in this room to hear it." All eyes turned to her. The guests leaned forward, their whispers fading into stunned silence. "John," she said, her gaze locked on him with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. "If you love me as much as you claim to, then tell me this." Her eyes flickered to Julia one more time, her voice hardening like iron. "Why were you holding Julia's hand this morning on the side of the road?" The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as a guillotine about to drop. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some guests covered their mouths, others exchanged wide-eyed glances of disbelief. Mothers leaned in to whisper to their daughters. Fathers straightened in their seats. John's smile froze on his face, his body stiffening as if he'd been struck by lightning. His eyes darted toward Julia for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Too fast for most to notice, but not for Sarah. What are you talking about?" John said, letting out a short, forced laugh. His eyes moved rapidly from Sarah to the crowd, scanning for someone to back him up. "You must be mistaken, love. I don't know what you think you saw, but—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuse like a blade. "Don't insult me, John." Her eyes locked on him with such intensity that even Father Paul felt a shiver run down his spine. She took a single step forward, and for the first time, John stepped back. "Father Paul saw you," Sarah continued, her voice rising with each word. "He saw you. I didn't want to believe it, but now I see it in your face. You were with Julia. This morning. Alone. In your car. Laughing. Holding her hand." Her voice echoed, filling every inch of the cathedral. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, her body trembling, but not with weakness, with power. The kind of power that comes when someone reaches their breaking point and decides they will never be broken again. John's mouth opened, but no words came out. His eyes darted to Julia, and that tiny, desperate glance was all it took. "Don't look at her," Sarah snapped, pointing a finger at him. "Look at me, John. Look at me." Her voice cracked, but it wasn't weakness. It was pain turning into strength. "I loved you. I gave you everything. I believed every lie you ever told me." She shook her head slowly, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. "But not anymore. Not today. Sarah, please," John's voice cracked, his mask of control slipping away. "Don't do this. Not like this. Not like this." She repeated his words with a bitter laugh. "No, John. Not like this. Not like you did this to me." The crowd was silent, every guest frozen in their seats, breath held as if they were watching a storm unravel in slow motion. Sarah turned, and for the first time, she faced Julia Elizabeth Farrow. The bridesmaid's eyes widened with panic, her breathing shallow. She shook her head slightly, as if to beg silently, "Don't do this. Don't expose me." "Julia," Sarah said, her voice softer now but no less dangerous. "Tell me something. How long?" Julia's lips quivered. Her hands shook. Her eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. She glanced at John, but he didn't look back. Her breathing grew heavier, her shoulders trembling. "Sarah, Julia stammered, tears welling in her eyes. Her voice broke under the weight of the truth. "I didn't mean for it to happen. Another gasp swept through the crowd. The whispers returned, louder this time, like the buzzing of 1,000 bees. You didn't mean for it to happen. Sarah's face twisted in disbelief. Her hands clenched into fists. So what, Julia? It just happened. You just fell into his car this morning. Your hands just happened to find each other. Her voice was sharp, relentless. No. You chose this. Both of you. Julia's tears fell freely now. Her gaze dropped to the floor, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Father Paul took a step forward, ready to intervene, but something stopped him. This was Sarah's moment. She had been humiliated, lied to, betrayed in front of everyone she loved. But now, she stood in front of them, unafraid to face the truth head-on. She faced the crowd, her voice clear and loud. This wedding is over. Her words echoed like thunder. No one moved. No one breathed. Every eye was on her. She didn't cry. She didn't break. I will not marry a man who cannot honor me. I will not stand next to a friend who can't respect me. Her eyes swept over the crowd, unwavering. I deserve better. I deserve more. The applause began slowly, one clap, then another, until the sound filled the cathedral like a rising wave. It wasn't everyone, but it was enough. Family members, old friends, even strangers who barely knew her, rose to their feet. Tears filled the eyes of mothers and daughters alike. Sarah turned away from John, away from Julia, away from the broken promises and shattered dreams. She walked back down the aisle, her head held high, her train of white silk trailing behind her like the cape of a queen. Father Paul watched her walk away, pride swelling in his chest. He had doubted himself that morning, questioned if he should have spoken up. But now, watching Sarah reclaim her strength, he knew he had made the right choice. The altar remained pure. John stood frozen at the front of the church, his face pale, his eyes hollow. Julia wiped at her face, her mascara smudging as she cried silently. Neither of them moved. Neither of them followed her. They couldn't. She had already left them behind. The wheels of the plane touched down on the runway with a soft jolt, the rumble of landing filling the cabin. The sun blazed high over Cartagena, Colombia, its golden rays pouring through the small oval windows, illuminating Sarah Nelson's face. She leaned her head against the cold glass, eyes half closed, exhaustion pulling at her, but her mind refused to rest. Her fingers traced small circles on the armrest, her gaze distant but focused. She was here. She had made it. A soft chime echoed through the plane, followed by the captain's voice announcing their arrival. Passengers stirred, unbuckling seatbelts, retrieving bags from overhead compartments. But Sarah didn't move right away. For a moment, she stayed still, staring out at the world beyond the window. The sea stretched endlessly into the horizon, blue upon blue, the waves glittering like diamonds under the fierce Colombian sun. It was beautiful. But what struck her the most was the air of freedom that seemed to linger in every wave, every gust of wind that swept across the beach. Freedom. That's what she had come for. With a deep breath, she unfastened her seatbelt and stood. The weight of her wedding gown was gone, replaced by a simple white linen blouse and light jeans. No more lace, no more flowers, no more stage to pretend on. She was no longer a bride. As she walked down the aisle of the plane, passing rows of strangers, she felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't sadness, nor was it anger. It was clarity. Her steps were lighter, her mind sharper. Each step away from Florence and everything she had left behind felt like shedding a layer of skin. The warm, humid air of Cartagena hit her as soon as she stepped out of the airport. It wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, but she welcomed it. She tilted her head back, letting the sun hit her face, eyes closed, breathing it all in. No guests. No stares. No whispers. No John. Just her. The taxi ride from the airport to her hotel was filled with the sounds of the city. Horns blaring, music spilling from street corners, vendors calling out the prices of fresh fruit. Life. Real, raw, unpolished life. She sat in the back seat, her head leaning against the window, watching it all go by. Colorful buildings with weathered walls. Street art on every corner. It was messy and imperfect, and she loved it. When the taxi pulled up to her hotel, she stepped out slowly, her eyes scanning the view. The building was quaint but charming, with white stucco walls and blue shutters that swung open to let in the ocean breeze. Vines of pink bougainvillea crept up its walls like nature's decoration. The woman at the front desk welcomed her with a bright smile and offered her a cool glass of lemon water. First time in Cartagena, the receptionist asked in Spanish, her tone friendly and warm. Yes, Sarah replied in Spanish, her accent stiff but understandable. First time here, first time anywhere like this. The receptionist's eyes softened with curiosity, but she didn't pry. Instead, she handed Sarah the room key with a gentle nod. Welcome, señorita. May this be the beginning of something beautiful for you. Sarah smiled, but it wasn't just a polite smile. It was genuine, small but real. I hope so too. Her room was on the third floor, overlooking the beach. The moment she unlocked the door, she felt a shift in the air. The space was small but cozy, with white linen curtains swaying softly in the breeze. She placed her suitcase on the bed and walked to the balcony. The view took her breath away. Below, the beach stretched wide, golden sand meeting the rolling waves. People walked along the shore, children playing, lovers holding hands, and older couples sitting quietly side by side. Life moved on, even after heartbreak. She stepped onto the balcony, her bare feet brushing against the cool tile. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The salty tang of the ocean filled her lungs, and as she exhaled, she felt a weight leave her chest. Slowly, she opened her eyes, gazing at the vast, open sea. I'm free, she whispered, as if speaking it out loud would make it more real. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand behind her. Her eyes flicked to it, her heart tensing out of habit. Her first thought was John, but she quickly shook it off. She had blocked his number. He had no place here. When she finally checked the screen, it was a message from her mother. It read, "Call me when you're ready. No pressure. Just love." Her eyes softened, and for the first time in a while, she didn't feel judged. Just love. Pure, uncomplicated love. She placed the phone down without responding, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't need to. Not yet. Her eyes drifted back to the sea. Her heart felt lighter, but there was still something unresolved, something tangled deep within her. She knew it wouldn't go away in a day, maybe not even in a month. But she had time. For once in her life, time was hers. That evening, she wandered the streets of Cartagena, letting her feet guide her with no plan, no destination. The colors of the city came alive under the glow of streetlights and lanterns hanging from balconies. Musicians played on the sidewalks, a soft strum of guitars and the rhythmic beat of drums blending with the hum of the crowd. She stopped at a small cafe with outdoor seating, drawn in by the smell of fresh arepas and the sweet aroma of coffee. She ordered an arepa con queso and a small cup of coffee, sitting at a table near the edge of the street. People walked past her, laughing, talking, living. She watched them as if watching a movie. Her eyes drifted toward a man sitting a few tables away. He was alone, too, flipping through a worn paperback book. He looked calm, focused, like he was reading every word as if it held a secret. He didn't seem to notice her, but she noticed him. There was something familiar about him, though she knew they had never met. He wasn't strikingly handsome, not in the way that John was, but there was something in the way he existed in his own space that intrigued her. His hair was dark and a little messy, his beard short but neatly trimmed. His clothes were simple, a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, faded jeans, and leather sandals. A breeze swept past, and he lifted his head for just a moment, looking up from his book. His eyes met hers. For a moment, neither of them looked away. He gave her a small nod, polite but sincere, before returning to his book. Sarah's lips parted slightly, as if she might say something, but she didn't. She smiled to herself, biting her bottom lip. No rush, she thought. No rush this time. Later that night, as she lay in bed, the soft sound of waves crashing against the shore lulled her to sleep. Her eyes felt heavy, but just before she drifted off, she whispered to the room, to herself, to no one in particular. Tomorrow, I'll go to the beach. Just me. No dress. No altar. Just me. The weight of it all finally lifted. No wedding, no John, no betrayal hanging over her. Just a woman learning how to breathe again. Her last thought before sleep took her was simple but powerful. I deserve more. The waves rolled in. The world outside continued to move. But this time, she wasn't running from it. She was part of it. The soft hum of the ocean was the first sound Sarah heard as she woke up. The early morning sunlight seeped through the white linen curtains, creating soft beams of light that danced on the tiled floor. The scent of the sea drifted in through the open balcony doors, mingling with the faint aroma of salt and tropical flowers. For the first time in a long while, she didn't wake up with a knot in her chest. There was no urgent to-do list, no need to prove anything to anyone, no wedding preparations looming over her. She lay there for a moment, her eyes tracing the soft swaying of the curtains as the breeze moved them back and forth like waves. Her phone sat on the nightstand, silent. No missed calls. No messages. No apologies. Nothing from John. She sat up slowly, running her fingers through her hair, still messy from sleep. Her eyes settled on the suitcase lying open at the foot of the bed. Inside, nestled neatly, was the white dress she had packed. Not her wedding dress, she had left that behind in Florence. This was a simple sundress, white like fresh linen, soft to the touch. A dress for herself, not for anyone else. Her feet touched the cool tile floor. She moved with purpose. No hesitation. No doubt. She pulled the sundress over her head, letting it settle on her body like a second skin. No makeup. No jewelry. No veil. Just her. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk down the narrow streets of Cartagena. She passed through alleyways with colorful walls covered in street art, each one telling a story, faces of revolutionaries, swirling patterns, abstract shapes. As she walked, she noticed small groups of people starting their day. Shop owners sweeping their doorsteps. Street vendors setting up fruit stands. A little boy chasing a ball that had escaped his grip. This is what life looks like, she thought. No pretense. No stage. Her sandals crunched softly against the cobblestone as she made her way to the shore. The distant sound of waves grew louder with every step. And then, all at once, the view opened before her. The beach stretched wide and endless, golden sand glowing under the sun's gentle warmth. The sea shimmered like liquid sapphire, rolling in with steady, hypnotic waves. The sky was a perfect canvas of blue, with a few lazy clouds drifting slowly overhead. She stepped onto the sand, pausing for a moment to feel its warmth beneath her feet. It wasn't smooth like polished stone, it was rough, uneven. But it was real. She crouched, letting her fingers sink into the grains, feeling their texture against her skin. She smiled softly to herself, brushing the sand off her hands. With slow, steady steps, she moved toward the water. The breeze carried the salty mist, cool against her skin. The sound of the waves was all around her, louder now, rushing and retreating in a rhythm that seemed to match her breath. Her eyes fixed on the horizon. Her pace quickened. Her heart followed. When she reached the edge of the shore, she didn't stop. She kept walking. Her feet met the cool water, and it rushed over her ankles, soaking the hem of her dress. The chill sent a shiver up her spine, but she didn't retreat. The water pulled back, and for a moment, she stood still, letting the sun warm her skin. But as the next wave rolled in, she took another step. And another. The water reached her knees. Then her thighs. Her dress floated around her like a lily on the water's surface. She closed her eyes and tilted her head back, letting the sun bathe her face. Her arms stretched out slowly, like she was surrendering to the sea, to the world, to herself. A deep breath in. Her chest rose. The air filled her lungs. And then, she dove. The world went quiet. Beneath the surface, everything was still. The distant roar of the city vanished, the weight of expectations, pain, betrayal, all gone. There was only the cool embrace of the sea, holding her like a mother cradling a child. Her body floated for a moment, weightless. Her hair swirled around her like seaweed caught in a gentle current. She stayed underwater for as long as she could, eyes closed, heart steady. It felt like she was being reborn. Her baptism. Her cleansing. When her lungs finally called for air, she broke the surface with a gasp. The sunlight hit her face, and she inhaled sharply, filling herself with fresh, new air. She wiped the water from her eyes and looked around. Everything looked brighter. The sea glittered. The sky seemed wider. The world, somehow, felt bigger than it had before. She swam for a while, her stroke strong, each movement pushing her farther away from the shore. Her heart was light. Her breaths were steady. Her body moved freely, like it had been waiting for this moment for far too long. When she finally returned to the beach, she stood at the water's edge, her dress clinging to her like a second skin, soaked and heavy. But she didn't care. It felt good to feel everything. A sound behind her caught her attention, the soft crunch of sand underfoot. She turned, squinting against the sun, and saw him. It was the man from the cafe. He wasn't looking at her directly. He was walking along the shoreline, his gaze fixed on the ground, as if searching for shells or stones. His hands were in his pockets, his rolled-up sleeves revealing forearms that were tanned from the sun. He looked different in the daylight. Less distant, more present. He stopped a few feet away from her, glancing up, finally noticing her. Their eyes met again. She didn't look away this time. He gave her a small nod, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It wasn't a polite, distant nod from the cafe. This one felt familiar. Like recognition. Like, I see you. She nodded back, just as small, just as simple. But something in her chest stirred. Not love. Not yet. Just something. Something new. They didn't speak. He continued walking down the beach, hands still in his pockets. She watched him for a while, until he disappeared around a rocky outcrop. But she didn't feel sad when he left. There was no aching pull of, what if, or, should I have said something? No rush, she reminded herself. She wrung the water from her dress, smoothing the fabric against her thighs, and gazed at the sea one last time. Her fingers brushed against the necklace she wore, a simple gold chain her mother had given her years ago. Her fingers toyed with it for a moment before she made a decision. She unhooked the clasp and slipped it off her neck. Her fingers held it for a moment, the chain dangling from her hand. It wasn't just a necklace anymore. It was the weight of the past. The version of herself who thought she had to be perfect for someone to love her. The woman who thought she needed to shrink herself to fit into someone else's life. With a deep breath, she walked back to the water's edge and, with a flick of her wrist, tossed the necklace into the sea. It vanished beneath the surface without a sound. For a second, she thought she might feel regret. But instead, she felt light. She turned and walked back up the beach, her wet dress clinging to her legs, her hair dripping with salt water. She felt the sun warm her back as the sea roared behind her. Her heart was quiet now. Not silent, just still. No chaos. No doubt. Just peace. By the time she reached her small hotel room, the dress had dried in the sun's heat. She stepped inside, breathing in the cool air, and sat on the edge of the bed. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. Her mother had sent another message. "You are stronger than you think, my love. Call me when you're ready." Sarah smiled, her eyes misting for just a moment. She typed back one word. "Soon." She lay back on the bed, her arms stretched wide, eyes on the ceiling. Tomorrow would come. But for once, she wasn't afraid of it. The next morning, the soft glow of the sun crept into Sarah's room, painting the walls with streaks of amber and gold. The distant crash of waves echoed like a steady drumbeat, calling her back to the shore. Her eyes blinked open slowly, and for a brief moment, she forgot where she was. But then she felt it, the warmth, the softness of the sea breeze filtering through the window. Cartagena. A small smile tugged at her lips. No weight pressed on her chest, no tight grip of anxiety, no broken dreams looming over her head. She stretched her arms above her head, feeling her muscles loosen like a cat waking from a nap. After a quick shower, she dressed in a light, floral sundress that swayed just above her knees. She tied her hair in a loose braid over her shoulder and slipped on a pair of simple leather sandals. No makeup, no jewelry. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror. "This is me," she thought. Her gaze held steady this time. No doubt. Her plan for the day was simple, no plan at all. Just the ocean, fresh air, and the promise of new experiences. She stepped out of the hotel and onto the vibrant streets of Cartagena. The sounds of the city embraced her like an old friend, the laughter of street vendors, the sizzle of food being cooked on open grills, and the gentle hum of people living their lives. Her walk was unhurried. She stopped to admire the colorful murals covering the walls, women with wild, flowing hair, men playing guitars, and scenes of daily life bursting with color. She bought a cup of fresh mango slices from a vendor and savored each bite as she walked. Sweet, tangy, alive. Her feet eventually led her back to the beach, her favorite place. The ocean glowed under the morning sun, and the air smelled of salt and endless possibility. She kicked off her sandals, letting her toes sink into the warm, golden sand. She walked along the water's edge, letting the waves wash over her feet. The feeling was familiar now. No longer a shock of cold, but a welcome embrace. Each step forward felt like she was moving further from her past, her mistakes, her heartbreak. Up ahead, she noticed someone sitting on a large, smooth boulder at the edge of the shore. His back was to her, but she recognized him instantly. The man from the cafe. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, staring out at the sea. His white button-down shirt billowed gently in the breeze, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. A small leather notebook lay open on his lap, and he held a pen in his hand, tapping it lightly against the page as if searching for the right words. Sarah slowed her pace, unsure if she should approach. Her instinct was to turn around, to avoid unnecessary attention. But why? She thought. This wasn't Florence. This wasn't her old life. She had no reason to retreat. So she kept walking. Slowly, steadily, her footsteps soft against the sand. When she got closer, he glanced over his shoulder, his face half-lit by the sun. Recognition flickered in his eyes. "Morning," he said with a small nod, his voice calm but friendly. "Morning," she replied, stopping a few feet away. Her eyes darted to the notebook on his lap. "Writing something important?" He glanced down at it, then gave a short chuckle. "Trying to. Doesn't mean it's any good." Her lips curved into a small smile. Must be better than not trying at all. He raised his eyebrows, impressed by the response, and nodded. Touché. He set the pen down and turned his body slightly toward her, his gaze steady but not intrusive. You were at the cafe the other day. Sarah tilted her head, letting her hair fall to one side. You noticed? You were staring at me, he said with a sly grin, his eyes crinkling with amusement. Her eyebrows shot up in mock offense. I was not staring. You were definitely staring, he replied, leaning forward, his grin widening. A laugh escaped her, soft but real. She shook her head, glancing toward the sea to hide her smile. Okay, maybe a little, she admitted. They both fell into a comfortable silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. She watched a pelican dive into the water and resurface with a small fish in its beak. The way it moved, fast, precise, successful on its first attempt, was oddly satisfying to watch. Do you come here to write every day? She asked, still watching the pelican. Not every day, he replied. But often enough. He glanced at her again, his gaze quieter this time, more thoughtful. You're not from here, are you? No, she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Italy. She hesitated, then added, I was supposed to be on my honeymoon. He didn't react with pity or shock, just nodded slowly, letting her words settle. Supposed to be, he echoed. But you're here alone. Yeah, she said, letting out a small breath. And I'm learning to be okay with that. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes steady, his expression calm. It's not easy, he said, leaning back on his hands. But it's brave. Her gaze shifted to him, her heart skipping a beat. It wasn't his words alone. It was the way he said them, not as if he was giving her a compliment, but as if he understood. Yeah, she replied softly. I think it is. Alexander, he said suddenly, holding out his hand to her. She looked at it for a second before taking it. Sarah. Nice to meet you, Sarah, he said with a small, genuine smile. Nice to meet you too, Alexander. Another pause. But it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of pause that felt natural, like two people breathing in sync. So, are you a writer? She asked, nodding toward the notebook on his lap. Sometimes, he replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Architect, technically. Writing's more of a side project. He shrugged. Sometimes, I just need a place to put my thoughts. Otherwise, they get too loud. Her eyes softened at that. I know what you mean. For the next hour, they talked. It wasn't forced. It wasn't filled with questions about each other's pasts. Instead, it was about the moment. The sea, the world, the strangeness of being alone but not lonely. They didn't know it then, but something was building between them, not romance, not yet. Just understanding. Before long, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, its warmth stronger now. Sarah stood and brushed the sand off her dress. I should head back, she said, tilting her head toward the small shops in the distance. Alexander nodded but didn't move. Maybe I'll see you around, Sarah. Maybe, she said, giving him a small wave before walking away. But she didn't walk fast. She didn't rush. She walked like someone who had just remembered what it felt like to be seen. Not as a bride. Not as a woman who'd been left. But as Sarah. Just Sarah. As she walked away, she glanced back once. He was still there, his pen moving steadily across the page of his notebook. She smiled to herself. Later that night, she sat on the balcony of her hotel room, a cup of herbal tea in her hands. The glow of streetlights below flickered softly, and the sound of distant music floated up from the alleys. Her heart was quiet. Her mind, still. She looked at her phone, at her mother's message from the day before. She tapped the screen, opening the message thread. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then, she typed, "I'm okay, Mom. I'm more than okay." Her thumb hovered over the send button for only a second before she tapped it. The wait was gone. The days in Cartagena passed like chapters of a story Sarah didn't know she was writing. Each morning began with the soft glow of the sun pouring through her balcony curtains, and each day ended with the steady lull of waves breaking against the shore. She had no schedule, no responsibilities, and for the first time in a long time, no expectations to meet. Her walks along the beach became a ritual. Barefoot on the warm sand, she let the sun kiss her skin and the sea breeze tangle her hair. She didn't think about John. Not anymore. Every time her mind tried to wander back to Florence, she would stop, take a deep breath, and remind herself, "I'm not there anymore." On her fourth day in Cartagena, she spotted him again. Alexander. He was sitting on the same large boulder, pen in hand, his leather notebook balanced on his knee. This time, she didn't hesitate. She approached with steady steps, her shadow stretching ahead of her on the sand. He glanced up before she even spoke, as if he had sensed her coming. "Back for more philosophy, huh?" he said, his lips curling into a half-smile. "Back for the sea," she replied, stopping a few feet away from him. Her eyes shifted to the notebook on his lap. "And maybe to see if you figured out how to fill that page." He glanced down at the notebook, letting out a small laugh. "I filled it. Then I ripped it out." He held up a crumpled page, the ink smudged in places where his hand had lingered too long. "Not every thought deserves to stay." Her gaze lingered on the page before flicking back to him. "Not every person does either." He raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Now that sounds like something worth keeping." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze played with the loose strands of her hair, and she tucked them behind her ear, her eyes locked on the sea. She sat down next to him, not too close, but close enough for their silence to feel shared, not separate. "You always write alone?" she asked, brushing grains of sand off her dress. "Not always," he replied, leaning forward with his arms resting on his knees. "But sometimes it's easier that way. No one around to judge the first draft." "Is that what you're afraid of?" she asked, tilting her head toward him. He chuckled, tapping the pen against his chin. "Not anymore." She nodded, her gaze still on the sea. "I used to live like that. Afraid of the first draft. Afraid it wouldn't be perfect." Her eyes shifted down to her hands resting on her lap. "I spent so much time trying to be everything for everyone else that I forgot how to be anything for myself." Her voice wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It was calm. Like she was finally naming something she had left unspoken for too long. Alexander turned his head toward her, his eyes soft with quiet understanding. He didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't offer hollow encouragement or say, "You'll be fine." He just let her speak. "I thought love was supposed to be like a fairy tale," she continued, drawing a small line in the sand with her fingertip. "That if you followed all the steps, you'd get your happy ending. But I did everything right. I loved him. I believed in him. And it still wasn't enough." Her finger pressed harder into the sand, drawing deeper lines. "Maybe that's the problem," Alexander said quietly. "Love isn't supposed to be something you win by following rules. It's not a prize at the end of a perfect story." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, she just stared at him. Not because she disagreed, but because he had put into words something she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Then what is it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, like she was afraid of the answer. Alexander leaned back on his hands, his eyes squinting against the sun. "Love is messy. It's showing up when it's hard, telling the truth when it hurts, and staying when it would be easier to leave." He glanced at her. "It's not the kind of thing that fits neatly into a fairy tale. It's too big for that." Her breath hitched in her chest. She looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Too big for that, she repeated softly, nodding to herself. They sat there for a while longer, listening to the sounds of the sea, letting the conversation drift with the tide. It wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. It just was. Before long, he stood, dusting the sand off his jeans. "I'm starving. There's a little food stall down the beach that sells arepas so good you'll dream about them." He looked down at her, offering his hand. "You coming?" She hesitated, glancing at his hand. For a moment, she felt the old instinct to say no. To stay in her comfort zone. To avoid risks. But then she remembered. "I'm not there anymore." She reached up and took his hand. His grip was firm, warm, steady. No hesitation. No doubt. "Lead the way, philosopher," she said with a grin. They walked along the beach together, her sandals hanging from her fingers, the sand warm beneath her feet. She glanced at him a few times as they walked, the way he moved, relaxed but present. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. He was fully in the moment. She liked that about him. At the food stall, Alexander ordered for them in fluent Spanish. She watched him speak with ease, joking with the cook as if they were old friends. When the arepas were ready, he handed one to her, still hot and steaming with melted cheese. She took a bite and let out an audible mmm as the flavors hit her tongue. "I told you," he said, watching her reaction with a grin. Okay, she admitted, wiping a crumb from the corner of her mouth. "You were right." "I like hearing that," he teased, taking a big bite of his own. They ate together on a nearby bench, overlooking the beach. Sarah watched the waves roll in, and for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to be anywhere else. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. Her breath caught for a moment, but when she opened it, it wasn't John. It was Julia. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I'm sorry. I never should have done what I did. I just wanted you to know that." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Her mind flashed with memories of Julia, the moment in the church, the lies, the betrayal. But she didn't feel the familiar sting of rage. She felt nothing. She locked the phone and slid it back into her pocket. "Not my weight to carry anymore," she whispered to herself. Alexander tilted his head. "What was that?" "Nothing," she said with a small shake of her head. "Just letting something go." He didn't press her for details. He just nodded. Some people knew how to let things go, too. When they finished eating, they wandered aimlessly through the streets of Cartagena. The sound of guitar music floated from a nearby plaza where street performers were gathering a crowd. Without thinking, she grabbed Alexander's wrist and pulled him toward it. "Come on," she said, her eyes bright. "Let's see." He laughed but followed willingly. The music was lively, and the crowd clapped along to the rhythm. A couple in the center spun and twirled to the beat, their bodies moving as if they were made of music. Sarah's gaze followed them, her eyes wide with delight. Alexander watched her. Not the dancers. Not the crowd. Her. Her smile wasn't polished or forced. It was the smile of someone who had been to the bottom of herself and come back stronger. She clapped along with the music, her body swaying with the rhythm. She was light. Unburdened. Alive. He smiled to himself, shaking his head as if he had just figured something out. "What?" she asked, catching his gaze. "Nothing," he said, his grin soft and knowing. "Just watching something beautiful." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. Not this time. The golden glow of the Cartagena sunset cast long, soft shadows across the plaza. The music had shifted from lively rhythms to a slower, more intimate melody played by a guitarist on the edge of the crowd. His fingers plucked each string with tenderness, each note lingering in the air like a quiet secret shared between friends. Sarah sat on the edge of a low stone fountain, her sandals dangling from her fingers. Her gaze followed the dancers still moving in slow, deliberate steps to the rhythm. Couples swayed together, their faces close, some of them smiling, some with their eyes closed as if the music was a story only they could hear. She glanced at Alexander, who leaned casually against a lamppost, his hands in his pockets. He watched the dancers too, but every so often, his eyes would flicker toward her. She noticed, but she didn't look away. This time, she held his gaze when it came. "You know," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her over the soft music, "you could be out there." Her eyebrows lifted in amusement. "Dancing? Why not?" He shrugged, stepping away from the lamppost. "Doesn't look too complicated. Step left, step right, spin around if you're feeling brave." He spun in place, his grin playful, boyish even. She shook her head, laughing under her breath. "You're ridiculous." He stepped closer, hands still in his pockets, but his eyes had a mischievous glint. "Ridiculous, maybe. But I'm right." He gestured toward the dancers with a nod of his head. "Come on, Sarah. You've already walked away from something that was weighing you down. Why not walk into something that lifts you up?" Her smile faded for a moment, and he saw it, that hesitation, that flicker of doubt. But it wasn't the same doubt she'd had before. This wasn't fear of him. This was fear of herself. She bit her bottom lip, glancing back at the crowd. Her fingers tightened around her sandals. "Do it, Sarah. Don't think. Just move." "I don't dance," she said quietly, but it wasn't conviction. It was habit. A script she'd told herself for too long. Alexander took one slow step forward. Then another. He was close enough now that she could see the sun reflecting off the gold flecks in his hazel eyes. No pressure. No rush. Just patience. "Everyone dances," he said softly. "Some just forget how." Her eyes shifted to his, her breath caught somewhere in her chest. Her heart wasn't racing, but it wasn't still either. It beat with something new. Something steady. Something alive. He held out his hand. "Don't think," he said, echoing the words she had thought moments ago. "Just move." Her lips parted, and for a second, she almost laughed. She tilted her head back, eyes closed, and let the last of the sun's warmth settle on her face. The music swirled around her like the waves of the sea. She thought of all the moments she had stayed still because it felt safer. Not anymore. Her eyes opened, and she met his gaze with a confidence she didn't even realize she had. She slid her sandals to the ground, stood, and without a word, took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. No grand gestures, no sudden pulls. Just an easy, quiet pull into the rhythm. Her feet moved with his, a step left, a step right. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. "See," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "You're already doing it." She smiled. A small one at first. Then it grew. He spun her slowly, one hand raised, and she turned with it, her hair sweeping over her shoulder. She stumbled on the last step, letting out a short laugh. His hand caught her waist, steadying her. "You good?" he asked, his grin lopsided. "Better than good," she replied, her cheeks flushed with the warmth of it all. "I'm free." They swayed together for a while, the world around them blurring into color and music. The crowd didn't matter. The past didn't matter. She was here, in this moment, with him, with herself. As the song ended, Alexander leaned in just slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "You dance well for someone who doesn't dance." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing with mock suspicion. "Maybe I just needed the right partner." His grin widened, a deep, slow laugh rumbling from his chest. Maybe you did. They stayed close for a moment longer than necessary. Neither of them moved to pull away. But neither of them rushed it either. That night, Sarah found herself walking back to her hotel with a lightness in her chest. Her steps were slower, more deliberate, as if she didn't want the night to end just yet. When she reached her balcony, she sat with her legs crossed, a cup of tea in her hands. The glow of Cartagena's lanterns flickered like fireflies below, and the hum of distant music still lingered in the air. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. For a moment, she didn't want to look at it. But this time, she wasn't afraid of what she'd see. She picked it up. Another message from Julia. I know you'll probably never forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type anything. Instead, she sat back and sighed deeply, letting it all settle. Forgiveness wasn't something she owed. It was something she could choose. She placed the phone face down on the table. Not out of anger. Not out of avoidance. But because she finally understood that she didn't have to respond to everything. The next day, as the sun rose over Cartagena, she met Alexander at the beach. This time, she wasn't surprised to see him. He had brought 2 coffees, holding one out to her with a grin. Thought you might need this, he said, handing it to her. Not all heroes wear capes, she replied, taking it with a smirk. They walked together along the beach, the waves curling at their feet. It wasn't like before. This time, it felt familiar. They didn't need to fill the air with words. Sometimes, silence was its own kind of conversation. Do you think you'll stay? He asked after a while, glancing at her from the side. Here, she asked, looking at the endless sea. For now. She took a sip of her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her chest. I'm not running anymore. I think I'll stay until it feels right to leave. Smart move, he said, his voice thoughtful. Leaving should always be a choice, not an escape. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, she wondered if he was speaking from experience. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Besides, she added, nudging him playfully with her elbow, I've got to make sure you finish at least 1 page in that notebook. He laughed, rubbing the back of his neck. Harsh critic, huh? Someone has to be. They reached the boulder where he usually sat, but this time, instead of perching on the edge, they both sat together. The sun climbed higher, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The sea shimmered like it was made of crushed jewels. You ever think, she said, resting her chin on her knees, that maybe everything had to break for something new to begin? He glanced at her, his gaze steady and warm. Yeah, he said quietly. All the time. They sat there until the sun was fully in the sky, 2 people who had once been broken but were slowly finding their way back to something whole. Not perfect. Not polished. But real. The sun hung high in the sky, its golden glow shimmering over the sea like molten gold. The waves were calmer that day, gently rolling onto the shore with a steady rhythm that seemed to match Sarah's breathing. She sat on the beach with her legs stretched out, her toes buried in the warm sand. Next to her, Alexander sat cross-legged, his notebook open on his lap. His pen hovered just above the page, unmoving, as if he was waiting for a word that refused to come. Occasionally, he glanced at her, his eyes soft but attentive, as though she were the answer he was searching for. Still nothing? She asked, tilting her head toward the notebook. He sighed, tapping the edge of the pen against his chin. Turns out, inspiration doesn't work on a schedule. She grinned, her eyes focused on the horizon. Maybe you're thinking too hard. Sometimes, the story's already there. You just have to stop chasing it. His eyes shifted to her, eyebrows raised. Was that meant for me, or for you? She blinked, surprised by his question. Her gaze dropped to the sand, and she brushed it aside with her fingers. Was it for him? Or was it for herself? Maybe both, she admitted, a small laugh escaping her lips. Alexander smiled, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. He opened his mouth to say something, but his words were cut off by the sharp, unexpected sound of a phone ringing. The familiar chime made Sarah's heart jolt. It wasn't her ringtone. It was his. Alexander pulled his phone from his pocket, frowning at the screen. His eyes darkened, his playful mood fading in an instant. "Everything okay?" she asked, noticing the shift in his expression. He glanced at her briefly, his jaw tight. "Yeah. Just, give me a sec." He stood, answering the call as he walked a few steps away. His voice was low, but the tension in his tone was unmistakable. She couldn't hear every word, but fragments floated toward her with the wind. "I told you, not now. This isn't the time, Lucy. Don't do this. Lucy." The name echoed in Sarah's mind, familiar in a way that made her feel uneasy. She glanced at him, watching the way his hand ran through his hair, his frustration evident in every movement. She had seen this before. The pacing. The sharp breaths. The forced calm of a man trying not to lose control. She knew this scene because she had lived it. She had lived it with John. Her chest tightened, her fingers curling into the sand. "Not again. I'm not doing this again." When Alexander ended the call, he turned back toward her, his face unreadable. He hesitated for a moment before walking back, his shoulders tense. "Everything good?" she asked, keeping her tone light but her eyes sharp. He nodded too quickly. "Yeah. Just work stuff." Work stuff. She knew that line too. It was the classic deflection. John had said the same thing every time his phone lit up with an unnamed number. Her eyes lingered on Alexander's face, searching for cracks in his armor. "Who's Lucy?" she asked, her voice calm but direct. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw it, that flicker of hesitation. It was quick, but it was there. "An old friend," he said slowly, his gaze dropping to the sand as he brushed his hands against his jeans. "Nothing to worry about." The lie was small, almost imperceptible. But Sarah had become an expert at spotting lies. They were like cracks in glass, invisible from one angle but glaringly obvious from another. "Nothing to worry about," she repeated softly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You sure?" He looked up, eyes meeting hers, this time with more weight behind them. "Yeah, I'm sure." The silence that followed wasn't like their usual silences. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't shared. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people both know something is being left unsaid. Sarah nodded slowly, but her heart felt heavier. "Okay." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking along the beach, but the ease between them had shifted. His eyes were on the waves, but hers were on him. That night, Sarah sat on her balcony, knees drawn to her chest, her eyes distant as she stared at the sea. Her phone buzzed softly beside her. She picked it up, expecting another message from her mother. But it wasn't. Her heart stopped. The name on the screen made her stomach twist. John. Her eyes locked on the screen, her heart beating so hard it echoed in her ears. He had no right to message her. She had blocked him. She had closed that chapter. Hadn't she? The message read, "I'm in Cartagena. I need to see you." Her breath caught in her throat. No. No, no, no. He's not here. He can't be here. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Every muscle in her body tensed as she stared at those words, each one sharp and invasive. The voice in her head began to echo louder, faster. "Ignore him. Don't respond. Don't let him in. But then, another message came. I just want to talk. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing in determination. Slowly, she opened her phone's settings, scrolled to her contact list, and hovered over his name. Delete. Block. Erase. Her thumb hovered over the option to block him again. But her mind wouldn't let her move. Her breath came faster. What if he's really here? What if he finds her? Her hands began to tremble. No. No more running. Her chest rose and fell with a deep breath. Her fingers moved, and instead of blocking him, she typed back. If you come near me, I will call the police. She hit send and threw the phone onto the bed, her heart pounding. Her breath was shallow, her eyes wide. She pressed her hands against her face, forcing herself to breathe. Breathe, Sarah. Breathe. A soft knock echoed from the door of her room. She froze, her heart stopping entirely. Her eyes darted to the door, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears. No. No, it can't be him. He wouldn't. Sarah. Her heart unclenched just a little. Alexander. Her legs felt shaky as she walked to the door. She pressed her hand against it for a moment, breathing slowly before unlocking it. When she pulled it open, he stood there, his brows furrowed with quiet concern. Hey, he said softly, glancing down at her like he could see every piece of her heart she was trying to hold together. I saw your light on. Thought I'd check in. She nodded, her throat dry. Yeah. I'm good. His eyes scanned her face. You sure? Her breath hitched, and her eyes dropped to the floor. She didn't want to admit it. Didn't want to feel like she was crumbling in front of someone again. But the weight was too much. Too much. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't expect him to move, but he did. Slowly, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. She didn't realize she was shaking until she felt the steadiness of him. Her head pressed against his chest, and she could hear it, his heartbeat. Strong. Steady. Unrushed. No questions. No explanations. Just warmth. He didn't say anything, and somehow, that was exactly what she needed. No words. Just the quiet, steady proof that she didn't have to hold it all on her own. I'm here, he murmured quietly, his voice like the distant hum of the sea. I'm here. Her eyes closed, tears brimming but not falling. She let herself lean into him, just for a moment. Not because she was weak. Not because she needed saving. But because she had finally learned that it was okay to lean on someone else. Her eyes flickered open, her gaze locking on the window, the sea beyond it. The waves were still crashing, still moving. Just like her. Her breathing slowed. Her heart quieted. She was no longer afraid. The air in Florence was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of fresh rain on stone. The cathedral stood as grand and unyielding as ever, its marble facade glowing under the soft morning light. People gathered at the entrance, dressed in shades of elegance, their voices low but filled with excitement. Inside, the air was different. Still. Sacred. Unshakable. Light poured through the stained glass windows, painting the stone floor with hues of red, blue, and gold. The sound of footsteps echoed softly as guests moved to take their seats. The familiar arrangement of white lilies lined the aisle, but this time, they didn't feel like symbols of something fragile. They felt like triumph. At the front of the cathedral, Father Paul Victor Charles stood near the altar, his hands folded calmly in front of him. His eyes gazed over the guests, his expression firm but peaceful. This time, there was no shadow of doubt in his heart. No hidden truth clawing at the edges of his mind. He glanced at the wooden cross behind him, as if silently affirming a promise made long ago. This altar was pure. This love was real. The distant sound of an engine hummed from outside, growing louder. Heads turned. People whispered. The sleek black car pulled up in front of the cathedral, its tires crunching softly against the wet stone. The door opened. First, one small foot emerged, followed by the eager leap of a boy with wild curls and an untamed smile. He wore a small, perfectly fitted black suit, but his bow tie hung crookedly on his neck. He landed with a little stumble, his eyes full of excitement. "Luke," came a firm but playful voice from inside the car. "Don't run off." The boy turned, his face scrunched with the mischievous grin of a child who knew he was being watched. But before anyone could stop him, a second boy tumbled out of the car, identical in every way except for the small dimple on his left cheek. "Mark, wait for me," Luke called, chasing after him as they both ran up the cathedral steps. Their footsteps echoed against the stone, the sound as lively as the flutter of birds taking flight. A woman stepped out of the car next. She was dressed in ivory silk, the gown simple but stunning in its elegance. Her hair was swept back into soft waves, and a small veil hung loosely from a gold comb in her hair. She stepped carefully, one foot in front of the other, her eyes watching the boys as she smiled to herself. Sarah Nelson. Her eyes glowed with the peace of a woman who had been through fire but emerged stronger. Her gaze swept over the crowd as she reached the top of the stairs. The whispers grew louder. Friends exchanged knowing glances. Relatives smiled, some wiping tears from the corners of their eyes. She saw them all. She saw the faces of people she once feared would judge her. But there was no fear now. She had faced her past, stood in the storm, and learned that she was stronger than she had ever believed. She no longer feared being seen. Her eyes flickered toward her sons, who were now playfully circling the fountain at the side of the entrance, their giggles filling the air. Her heart swelled. They were her legacy. Proof that love could be built from broken pieces. Then, she lifted her gaze to the man standing at the top of the stairs, waiting for her. Alexander. He stood tall, his eyes locked on her as if she were the only person in the world. He wore a dark gray suit, perfectly tailored, but it wasn't his clothes that made him stand out. It was the way he looked at her. Like she was a choice he would make every single day. No doubt. No hesitation. Just certainty. When she reached him, he stepped forward, offering his hand. His eyes softened as he looked at her, his voice low but steady. "You ready?" he asked, his lips curving into a quiet smile. Her fingers slid into his, and she squeezed gently. Her eyes, unwavering, met his. "I've been ready for a long time," she replied. They walked in together, side by side, with Luke and Mark following behind them, their small steps tapping lightly against the stone floor. The crowd stood, a quiet, collective breath filling the room. This time, there would be no interruptions. The music began, soft and slow, filling the air with warmth and serenity. Their steps were slow but deliberate, like every step was a promise in itself. Each moment they had lived, every heartbreak, every doubt, every painful goodbye, had brought them here. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a perfect story. It was a story that had been built on truth, growth, and love that had been tested by fire. When they reached the altar, Father Paul smiled at them both. He glanced briefly at Sarah, his eyes filled with pride and quiet joy. No words were needed. She knew he had always been on her side. Father Paul raised his hands, his voice calm but strong. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have chosen each other not out of need, but out of love. A love that has faced doubt. A love that has withstood pain. A love that is not perfect, but real." Sarah felt her throat tighten. Her gaze remained locked on Alexander. "Marriage is not a prize," Father Paul continued. "It is a promise. A choice made every day, not just today. It is a choice to be kind when it is easier to be cruel. To be honest when it would be simpler to lie. It is the decision to stand together not because it is easy, but because it is worth it. He paused, looking at Sarah, then at Alexander. If anyone here has reason to object to this union, he said, his gaze sweeping the crowd, speak now or forever hold your peace. Silence. Pure, beautiful, absolute silence. This time, no one stood. No one spoke. Sarah felt Alexander squeeze her hand, and she squeezed back, her heart steady as the waves of Cartagena had been on that fateful day. Do you, Alexander Victor Morgan, take Sarah Nelson to be your wife, your partner, your companion, and your equal, for as long as you both shall live? Alexander didn't hesitate. His voice was clear, unwavering. I do. Father Paul turned to Sarah, his smile soft but knowing. And do you, Sarah Nelson, take Alexander Victor Morgan to be your husband, your partner, your companion, and your equal, for as long as you both shall live? She drew in a breath, not because she was unsure, but because she wanted to feel every second of this moment. Every word. Every promise. I do, she said, her voice strong and certain. Father Paul's voice rose with joy. Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may now seal your vows with a kiss. Alexander grinned, his eyes lighting up as if he had been waiting for those words his entire life. He leaned in, his hand gently cradling the side of her face, and kissed her. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't grand. It was slow, steady, and full of every unspoken promise they had ever made to each other. The crowd erupted into applause. Luke and Mark jumped up and down at the front of the aisle, cheering louder than anyone. Mommy! Mommy! Luke called, his little hands clapping with wild enthusiasm. You did it! Sarah pulled away from Alexander, laughing as she wiped the tears from her cheeks. She crouched down, arms wide as her boys ran to her, throwing themselves into her embrace. She kissed their heads, her heart full in a way she never thought possible. As she stood, Alexander crouched down beside her, ruffling the boy's hair. You know, he said, grinning at them, you two are next. You've got to walk back down the aisle with us. Can I do a cartwheel? Luke asked with wide eyes. Alexander's grin widened. If you can land it, little man. Laughter echoed through the cathedral as the family walked back down the aisle together. No longer two. No longer broken. They were whole. Not perfect. But whole. The celebration continued long after the vows were spoken. Laughter echoed through the grand reception hall, a wide space filled with soft golden lights hanging from the ceiling like stars. The tables were adorned with simple arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, the subtle fragrance filling the air. The steady hum of conversations blended with the gentle notes of live violin music playing in the background. Plates clinked, glasses chimed in toasts, and joyful voices floated through the air like music of their own. Children chased each other around the dance floor, their giggles light as bubbles in the air. At the center of it all, Sarah stood with Alexander, their hands intertwined. She glanced around the room, her heart full of something she didn't have words for. Peace. Freedom. Joy. Maybe it was all of them. Her gaze fell on her two boys, Luke and Mark, who had somehow convinced one of the groomsmen to lift them onto his shoulders. They waved their little arms like kings commanding their kingdom. The sight made her laugh so hard she had to press a hand to her chest. They're going to be unstoppable, Alexander said, his voice close to her ear. They already are, Sarah replied, her eyes following her boys as they spun in wild circles, their faces glowing with happiness. Alexander glanced at her, his gaze tender, unwavering. His voice softened. Just like their mother. Her breath caught for a moment, her heart skipping a beat. She turned to him, eyes searching his face, as if trying to see if he really meant it. But there was no doubt there. His eyes held hers as if he had known her his whole life. "I'm not unstoppable," she said quietly, tilting her head toward him. "I just stopped letting fear win." Alexander's smile grew wider, slow and full of pride. "That sounds pretty unstoppable to me." She felt her cheeks grow warm, but she didn't look away. "Not this time. Not anymore." Later that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of pink, orange, and violet across the sky. The warmth of the day slowly gave way to the cool stillness of the evening. Lanterns had been lit along the edge of the garden, their soft glow creating a dreamy, enchanted atmosphere. Sarah stood at the edge of the garden, her fingers tracing the smooth stem of her wine glass. Her wedding dress moved gently with the breeze, and her hair, now untied, swayed freely over her shoulders. Her gaze was on the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight faded behind the hills. She took a slow sip of her wine, the taste of it grounding her. For a moment, she thought of how far she had come. She had once stood at this very place, weeks before, broken and unsure. She had looked at that same horizon and wondered if she would ever feel whole again. But now, she knew. She was whole. The sound of footsteps crunching softly against the gravel behind her pulled her back to the present. She didn't turn around. She already knew who it was. "You're supposed to be inside," Alexander's voice came, calm but playful. "So are you," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "Fair point," he said, stepping up beside her. He didn't speak right away, just looked out at the same horizon she had been watching. Silence between them had become familiar, like the rhythm of a song they both knew. For a while, neither of them said anything. The distant chirping of crickets filled the space, and the gentle breeze whispered through the trees. "Feels different, doesn't it?" she asked, her voice light but thoughtful. "What does?" "Peace," she replied, glancing at him. "When you've lived in chaos for so long, peace feels strange." Alexander tilted his head, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "Yeah," he admitted, turning to face her fully. "But strange doesn't mean bad." She smiled softly, nodding. "No. It doesn't." They stood there for a moment longer, their gazes locked. Then, slowly, Alexander raised his hand and brushed a strand of hair away from her face. His fingers lingered for just a second longer than necessary. "You're thinking too much," he said gently. "Am I?" she asked, her eyebrows lifting in playful challenge. "Yeah," he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "I can see it. Your eyes do this little thing where they narrow, like you're solving a puzzle no one asked you to solve." Her laugh came quickly, a bright, honest sound. She shook her head, tilting it back slightly as she gazed at the stars. "Maybe I am," she said with a grin. "But old habits are hard to break." "Not impossible, though," he said, leaning in just a little closer. "You've already broken the hardest ones." Her gaze dropped back to him, and she felt it again, that steady, grounding warmth he always seemed to carry with him. She hadn't believed in fairy tales for a long time, but maybe she didn't need one. She just needed something real. Their eyes lingered on each other. Not with urgency. Not with fear. But with the quiet, unspoken understanding of two people who had walked through fire and come out stronger. No rush. No pressure. Just trust. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, stepping back and holding out his hand. Her eyes squinted at him with playful suspicion. "There's no music." "There's always music," he replied, his grin widening. "Sometimes you just have to listen for it." Her heart swelled in her chest, and before she could overthink it, she took his hand. His fingers curled around hers, and he pulled her gently toward him. They stood close, their steps slow, their movements in sync even without a rhythm to guide them. Her head rested lightly on his shoulder as they moved together under the night sky. The stars above them shimmered like scattered diamonds, and the world felt perfectly still. No music. No words. Just them. A week later. The front door to their new home creaked open, and the sounds of chaos immediately followed. Luke and Mark barreled in like small hurricanes, their backpacks hanging halfway off their shoulders as they raced down the hallway. "Last one to the kitchen is a snail," Luke shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls. "Not fair, you started first," Mark yelled, his little legs moving as fast as they could. Sarah stepped into the house, balancing 2 bags of groceries in her arms. She watched them with a look that was somewhere between exasperation and affection. "Shoes off, boys," she called, nudging the door closed with her hip. Alexander appeared from around the corner, already tugging one of the boys' sneakers off mid-run. "They never listen," he said, shaking his head with a grin. "They get it from you," Sarah shot back, raising an eyebrow as she placed the bags on the counter. "Oh, so I'm to blame now?" he asked, leaning against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed. "Absolutely," she replied with a playful smirk. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was only them. No noise. No running children. No weight from the past. Just them. He moved toward her slowly, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her in with a gentle tug. Her forehead pressed against his chest, and she breathed him in, the faint scent of cedarwood and something that was just him. "Happy?" he asked quietly. Her eyes closed as she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "Really happy." The sound of a loud crash made them both jolt. "It wasn't me," Luke shouted from the kitchen. "It was definitely him," Mark yelled, his voice a little too honest. Sarah sighed, her head still resting on Alexander's chest. "I'll handle it." "No, I got it," he said, planting a kiss on her temple. "You deserve at least 5 minutes of peace." 5 whole minutes, she teased. "You spoil me." He winked as he walked toward the kitchen, his voice already warning the boys about the rules of the kitchen like he did every day. She stayed where she was, eyes closed, arms still around herself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always quiet. But it was real. And for the first time, she wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. The past was behind her. The storm was over. And in its place, she had built something new. Something whole. Something hers. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind of quiet that only comes when everything is finally at peace. The soft hum of the washing machine echoed from down the hall. Sunlight streamed in through the large living room windows, casting golden rectangles on the hardwood floor. Luke and Mark were sprawled on the carpet, building a fortress out of plastic blocks, their faces twisted in concentration. Every so often, one of them would shout, "No, not there. It'll fall," and the other would roll his eyes like a seasoned architect. At the kitchen counter, Sarah stood chopping vegetables, her hands moving methodically, her mind calm. The soft scrape of the knife against the cutting board was oddly soothing. She glanced up at the boys, her heart filling with that familiar warmth she never got tired of feeling. Her boys. Her home. Her life. The faint sound of footsteps made her glance over her shoulder. Alexander entered the kitchen, barefoot, his hair still damp from his shower. He wore a plain white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, and somehow, he still managed to look effortlessly put together. He leaned against the counter next to her, his eyes scanning the vegetables. "Need help with that?" he asked, already reaching for a second knife. "You're just looking for an excuse to sneak a taste," she said, narrowing her eyes at him. "Guilty," he replied with a grin, plucking a piece of red bell pepper from the cutting board and popping it into his mouth. She laughed, shaking her head as she moved the carrots closer to her side of the board, out of his reach. "You're worse than the boys." "Hey," he said, raising his hands in defense. "The boys learned it from me. I'm just maintaining tradition." Her laugh came easier now. It didn't feel forced or fragile. It felt full, natural. Like it belonged here. But then, it happened. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't urgent. Just 3 sharp, precise taps. Her hands froze on the knife, her eyes flickering toward the front door. Her heartbeat quickened, not because of the sound, but because something about it felt wrong. Too familiar. Too sharp. Alexander noticed the shift immediately. His eyes narrowed as he followed her gaze toward the door. He set his knife down slowly. Expecting someone, he asked quietly, his voice cautious but calm. "No," she replied, her voice tight. "No one." Her heart started to race. Her fingers curled against the countertop, pressing into the cool surface. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved toward the door, her footsteps slower than usual. Her mind already knew, but her heart was in denial. Luke glanced up from his block tower, his eyes curious. "Mom, who's that?" "Don't worry, baby," she said, her voice steady but low. "Just stay there, okay?" Mark followed his brother's gaze, his brow furrowing. "Is it Grandma?" "No," she said, offering them a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Stay with your brother." She reached the front door and stared at it for a moment. Her breath slowed, her heart pounding steadily in her ears. Her fingers hovered over the lock. She glanced back once, and her eyes met Alexander's. He knew. He didn't have to ask. "Want me to open it?" he asked softly, taking a slow step forward. "No," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I'll do it." Her fingers turned the lock with a sharp click. She gripped the handle, braced herself, and opened the door. There he was. John Benjamin Reed. He stood there on the porch, hands in his pockets, wearing a dark navy jacket over a crisp white shirt. His face hadn't changed much, but something about him felt smaller than before. Less certain. His once perfectly slicked back hair was a little messy, like he'd run his hands through it too many times. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them felt quieter than it had any right to be. The faint sound of children laughing in the distance was the only thing grounding her in reality. "Hi, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth as ever. His eyes scanned her face with an unsettling familiarity. Her heart was no longer racing. It had steadied into something colder. Harder. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. She didn't step back. She didn't shrink. "What do you want, John?" she asked, her tone flat, each word precise. His eyes shifted briefly to the house behind her, scanning it the way someone scans a room they believe they still belong in. His lips curved into a half-smile. "Nice place. I can see you've done well for yourself. Don't engage. Don't take the bait. Say what you came to say," she replied, her voice sharp as glass. His smile faltered. He rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the ground for a second before looking at her again. The act. The regretful man performance. She'd seen it before. He began, exhaling slowly. "I wanted to talk. That's all. Just talk." Her eyes narrowed. "About what?" "About us." Her laugh was short, sharp, and dry. "There is no us, John." His eyes flinched, barely, but she saw it. "Look, I know I messed up, okay? I made mistakes. But people change, Sarah." He leaned forward, his eyes intense now, like he was trying to break through her resolve. "I've changed." Her grip on the door tightened. Her heart didn't race. Her breath didn't quicken. She felt nothing. "You came all the way here to say that?" she asked, tilting her head, her voice calm in a way that made him shift uncomfortably. "You think showing up like this is going to do anything but waste my time?" His jaw tightened. The charm began to crack. "I just thought. No, she interrupted, her eyes like stone. That's the problem, John. You never think. You act. You lie. You take. But you don't think. His face hardened, his lips pressed into a thin line. There he was. The real John. The one who showed up when things didn't go his way. You don't have to do this, he said quietly, his eyes flicking to something behind her. We have history, Sarah. Doesn't that count for something? Her lips twitched with the start of a smile, but it wasn't a kind one. She leaned forward just a little, her eyes sharp as daggers. History is just that, John. The past. She raised her chin, her gaze unwavering. I'm done living there. His eyes darted to something behind her again, and she knew exactly what he was looking at. Don't look at them, she said, her voice like steel. Don't even think about it. His eyes snapped back to hers, and for the first time, she saw it, he had no power here. Not anymore. Leave, she said, her voice firm, absolute. If you show up here again, I'll call the police. Do you understand me? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. She saw him swallow whatever words he had been about to say. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets, jaw tight, eyes distant. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say something more, but he didn't. He turned and walked down the path, his steps slower than when he'd arrived. She didn't watch him leave. She closed the door, locked it, and leaned her back against it. Her breath left her in a single, sharp exhale. Her eyes squeezed shut for a second. Two small hands touched her sides. She opened her eyes and saw Luke and Mark looking up at her, their faces full of curiosity and concern. Mommy, who was that? Luke asked. Her gaze softened. She crouched down, pulling both boys into a hug so tight they squealed in surprise. Nobody, baby, she said, her voice strong, steady. Just a shadow. Her eyes lifted, and she saw Alexander leaning against the kitchen doorway, his eyes on hers. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He knew. And she knew. The past had knocked on her door. But this time, she didn't let it in. That night, the house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that made you feel alone. It was the warm, steady quiet of peace. The only sounds were the faint buzz of the kitchen light, the hum of the refrigerator, and the gentle rustle of the curtains as the night breeze slipped through the open window. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the porcelain mug. Her gaze was distant, not fixed on anything in particular. Her mind wasn't racing. It was just thinking. Quietly. Calmly. Across from her, Alexander sat with his arms crossed on the table, watching her with the kind of patience most people didn't have. He didn't ask questions. He didn't interrupt the silence. He just watched, his eyes steady, like he was waiting for her to find her words. She glanced at him and let out a small, quiet laugh. You're staring. He tilted his head slightly, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I'm observing. Is there a difference? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, he replied, leaning forward, his eyes playful but sincere. Staring is thoughtless. Observing means I'm paying attention. Her smile faded just a little, her eyes softening. He was paying attention. He always paid attention. For a while, they sat in that shared quiet. But eventually, she set her mug down and sighed, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. He showed up today, she said, her voice measured and calm, like she was stating a fact rather than reliving it. Alexander didn't flinch. He already knew. His eyes didn't narrow. His jaw didn't clench. He simply sat straighter, leaning his forearms on the table. Did he say anything? He asked, his voice even. Same old story, she said with a small shrug. He's changed. He regrets it. He wants to talk. Her eyes flicked to Alexander, her expression sharp but steady. He wants me to give him permission to feel better about himself. Alexander let out a short, quiet breath, shaking his head. Sounds familiar. Doesn't it? She replied, her eyes rolling upward for a second. They never change. Silence settled over them again, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding. I'm proud of you, he said, his eyes fixed on hers. Her gaze lifted slowly, her eyebrows drawing together in confusion. For what? For not letting him in, Alexander said, his voice low but firm. For knowing you didn't have to. She sat there for a moment, letting those words settle in. She'd spent so much of her past fighting to be seen, to be enough, to hold things together that were never meant to stay whole. But now, for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to fight for anything. Her heart wasn't at war with itself. It was still. Yeah, she said quietly, her lips curving into a small smile. Me too. Later that night, the house was finally asleep. Luke and Mark had collapsed on the couch after arguing over who was the king of the couch, until they both gave up and fell asleep on top of each other. Sarah had carried them to their room, one at a time, their small bodies limp with the deep sleep only children knew how to fall into. Now, she stood in front of their bedroom door, the light from the hallway stretching into the room like a soft golden path. She watched them for a moment, taking in the sight of their peaceful faces, their little chests rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Her fingers brushed lightly over the doorframe, her heart filling with something too big to name. Gratitude. Love. Pride. All of it. Her eyes flickered to the small bookshelf near their bed, where a single photo frame stood. It was a picture of the four of them, her, Alexander, Luke, and Mark, taken on the beach just a few weeks ago. Her hair was messy from the wind, Alexander's grin was crooked, and the boys had sand all over their clothes. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. Her lips pressed into a small smile, and she closed the door quietly. When she turned around, she saw Alexander leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze already on her. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His eyes said enough. You good? He asked softly. Yeah, she said, nodding slowly. Yeah, I'm good. They walked back to the living room together, his hand brushing lightly against her back, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't walking alone. The next morning, the house was alive with noise. Luke was running through the hallway in his superhero pajamas, a bright red cape tied around his neck. I'm Lightning Force, he yelled as he dodged imaginary villains, leaping over pillows he had scattered on the floor as lava. Not the pillows again. Sarah called from the kitchen, but her voice was more amused than frustrated. Mark followed right behind him, holding a spatula like a sword. I'm Captain Power. I'm stronger than you, Lightning Force. Never. Luke shouted, leaping onto the couch like it was his battleground. Alexander stepped into the hallway, a toothbrush still in his mouth. He stopped and watched them for a moment, one eyebrow raised in disbelief. The chaos was unavoidable. But it was their chaos. You want to call a truce? He asked them, his words muffled by the toothbrush. Never, they both yelled in unison, their faces lit with wild joy. Alexander sighed dramatically, walking past them. All right, but don't come crying to me when Captain Power turns on his sidekick. I'm not the sidekick. Mark yelled back, his face scrunching in offense. Sarah laughed from the kitchen, leaning on the counter as she stirred pancake batter in a bowl. She glanced up at Alexander as he walked in, still brushing his teeth. Want to save the city from total destruction? She asked, lifting the bowl like it was a sacred offering. He leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning her face with that familiar gaze of his. The one that made her feel seen, completely and entirely. He tilted his head, toothbrush still in his mouth. Pancakes count as saving the city, he asked, his words slurred with foam. Today they do, she said, tilting the bowl toward him. But only if you help flip them. He gave her a slow, playful grin, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He reached for a spatula from the drawer, pointing it at her like it was a sword. Captain Powers got nothing on me, he said, his voice full of mock seriousness. Her laughter echoed through the kitchen, mixing with the sound of the boys' wild adventure in the hallway. It wasn't the kind of life she had once dreamed of. It was better. No spotlight. No perfection. No grand, sweeping gestures. Just love that showed up, stayed, and stayed steady. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it briefly. The notification showed one new message from Julia. For a second, her fingers hovered over the screen. Then, she picked it up, opened the message, and read. I know I said it before, but I'm saying it again. I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am. I hope you're happy. Sarah set the phone down slowly, her heart calm, her mind clear. She stared at the message for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. Forgiveness doesn't always come with an answer. Sometimes, it comes with peace. She didn't respond. Instead, she put the phone aside, took a deep breath, and poured the pancake batter onto the griddle. Luke ran into the kitchen, his cape flapping behind him. Mom! Did you see me? I flew. I really flew. She crouched down, holding her arms out wide. He ran straight into her hug, his arms locking around her neck. I saw, baby, she whispered, pressing her cheek against his messy curls. I saw everything. Alexander flipped a pancake behind them, his eyes glancing at her once more. She saw everything. And for once, she wasn't afraid of what was coming next. The sky outside the house was a canvas of soft blues and pale golds, the early morning sun peeking through the clouds like a quiet promise. The house was calm for once. Luke and Mark were still asleep in their shared room, their small bodies tangled in blankets, their superhero capes draped over the bedposts like battle flags of a long-won war. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands. She wore one of Alexander's gray t-shirts that hung loose over her shoulders and a pair of soft cotton shorts. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands of it falling around her face. She didn't care. Comfort over perfection, that was the new rule. Her eyes were fixed on the small stack of papers in front of her. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, Notice of Employment Opportunity, Position, Director of Community Relations. Her lips pressed together in a thin line as she scanned the details. It was everything she used to dream about. Stability. Leadership. A title with meaning. The pay was good. The benefits even better. But something about it felt heavy. Like putting on an old coat that didn't fit anymore. You're doing that thing again, came a familiar voice behind her. She glanced over her shoulder to see Alexander, leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over his chest. His hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes still soft with that early morning haze. He looked like he belonged there, like he'd always belonged there. What thing? She asked, turning back to the paper but not really reading it. I'm thinking myself into a whole thing, he said, walking up behind her. He rested his hands on her shoulders, his thumbs pressing gently into the knots of tension at the base of her neck. You tilt your head to the left, squint like you're trying to solve the world's hardest puzzle, and you tap your thumb on the table exactly 3 times. Her lips parted in surprise, and she glanced at her hand. Her thumb was, in fact, tapping the table. She turned to him, giving him a look of playful disbelief. You're a little too observant, you know that. That's what I keep telling you, he said with a grin, leaning down to kiss the top of her head. His warmth lingered, and for a second, she let herself lean back into him, her shoulders relaxing under his touch. He glanced at the papers over her shoulder, tilting his head. Big decision? He asked, his tone light but curious. Could be, she said, turning the page over like it might change something. It's a job offer. Well, more like a recruitment email. The position's in Florence. She felt him pause behind her, his fingers stilling on her shoulders. He didn't pull away, but she felt the shift in him. Florence. The name of the city alone carried weight. That's a lot, he said carefully. He didn't ask her what she wanted to do. He didn't try to steer her one way or another. He knew better. Yeah, she said, letting out a slow breath. It's a good position. Big pay. It's everything I used to want. Used to? He echoed, stepping around to face her. He leaned against the counter, his eyes searching hers, his gaze steady as always. What do you want now? The question hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She blinked, staring down at the paper like it would answer for her. But it didn't. I don't know, she admitted softly, looking up at him. I thought I knew. For so long, I was chasing stability. Titles. Security. I wanted to prove I could be enough. For my parents. For John. For everyone. Her hands pressed flat on the counter. But now. I don't want to chase anymore. Alexander nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. He didn't fill the silence. He let her feel it. Let her hear herself. You don't have to chase, he said quietly. Not anymore. Her eyes met his, and she felt that familiar warmth rise in her chest. Safety. Not the kind that comes from money or status, but the kind that comes from being seen. She glanced at the paper one last time, her fingers brushing over the words, Director of Community Relations. It sounded impressive. It sounded important. But did it sound like her? Her lips curled into a soft, thoughtful smile. She folded the paper in half and placed it on the counter. Not thrown away. Not ignored. Just put aside. Not today, she whispered to herself, and for the first time, it didn't feel like she was giving up. It felt like she was choosing herself. Later that afternoon, Luke and Mark burst into the living room with their backpacks swinging wildly behind them. Mommy, guess what? Guess what? Luke shouted, his eyes wide with excitement. Slow down, lightning bolt, Sarah said, grinning as she crouched down to his level. What happened? Mark pushed ahead of Luke, holding up a colorful flyer like it was a treasure map. There's a talent show. At school. And we can join. His eyes were wild with excitement. I want to do a magic act. No, we're doing a dance. Luke argued, his hands on his hips. I've been practicing, Mom. Look. He spun in place, kicking his legs out in a move that was something. Sarah bit her lip to hold back a laugh. She glanced at Alexander, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, already grinning. Magic or dance, huh? She asked, raising an eyebrow. Both. Mark insisted, his little fists clenched with determination. I can do magic, and Luke can dance, and we'll be unstoppable. Her heart swelled at the way they said unstoppable like it was the most natural thing in the world. She reached out, ruffling their hair. You already are, baby, she said, pulling them both in for a quick hug. That night, as the boys slept, Sarah and Alexander sat on the back porch. The sky was clear, and the stars stretched endlessly above them. The quiet of the night surrounded them, but it wasn't an empty quiet. It was the kind that felt full. Her head rested on his shoulder, her fingers tracing small circles on his hand. Do you ever wonder, she asked, her voice low and thoughtful, if we're supposed to have everything figured out? He glanced down at her, his smile slow and steady. Nope. She tilted her head to look at him, waiting for more. He shrugged. If you have it all figured out, what's left to learn? I think it's better this way. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. How do you always have the right answer? Don't be fooled, he said, smirking. I'm just making it up as I go. She laughed, her body shaking against him. Her eyes lifted to the stars. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt open. Florence, huh? He said after a while, his voice quiet but certain. She hummed, her gaze still on the sky. Yeah. You thinking about going back? She was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she shook her head. I don't need to, she said softly. She turned her head, her eyes meeting his. Everything I was looking for, is here. His eyes softened, his gaze full of something deep and unshakable. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers. Home, he murmured. Home, she repeated, closing her eyes. And just like that, the weight she'd been carrying for years, the fear of being left, the fear of being not enough, the fear of falling short, lifted. No more chasing. No more running. No more doubt. Her heart was still. Her mind was clear. She didn't need the title. She didn't need Florence. She just needed this. The late autumn breeze swept through the backyard, carrying with it the crisp scent of fallen leaves and the distant hum of chirping crickets. The orange glow of the setting sun spilled across the sky, casting fiery streaks of gold, pink, and violet over the world below. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel a little more still. A little more certain. The backyard was alive with sound, though. Luke and Mark were running around, laughing wildly as they chased each other with foam swords. Every swing, every block, every, take that, villain, echoed through the air like music. Their small feet pounded against the grass, and their capes, yes, the capes again, fluttered behind them like banners of war. From the wooden patio, Sarah watched it all unfold, her elbows resting on the edge of the table. Her face was relaxed, her smile soft but unshakable. The kind of smile that comes from knowing, with every part of yourself, that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. Careful, Mark, she called, her voice warm but firm. No swords near the face. Yes, Mommy. Mark shouted back, but he swung his foam sword twice as hard at Luke's shield. Luke stumbled but grinned wide, shouting, You'll never defeat me, Captain Power. Sarah shook her head, her heart full in a way she still wasn't used to. She leaned back in her chair, one leg crossed over the other, and took a long sip of her tea. The warmth of it matched the warmth in her chest. The screen door behind her creaked open, and she felt a familiar presence before she even looked. Alexander. He stepped outside carrying a tray with 2 plates of grilled sandwiches and a small bowl of fresh fruit. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and there was a faint streak of flour on his forearm, probably from earlier when he'd insisted on experimenting with homemade dough for dinner. He set the plates down on the table and sat next to her with a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck like he'd been carrying the weight of the world. But then his eyes met hers, and just like that, he relaxed. His peace was here, too. 2 brave nights, he said, nodding toward the boys. No chance of a truce, I'm guessing. Not until bedtime, Sarah replied with a grin, watching as Luke rolled across the ground in an exaggerated, defeat pose while Mark stood over him, victorious. But I'm sure Captain Power will rise again tomorrow. Alexander let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Of course he will. He glanced at her, his eyes lingering longer than usual, like he was seeing something only he could see. What? She asked, tilting her head. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. His eyes never left hers. I was just thinking about how lucky I am. Her smile faltered just slightly, her heart doing that familiar, slow, steady thud that happened every time he looked at her like that. Careful, she teased, pointing at him. You keep talking like that, and I might start believing you. Good, he replied, his voice soft but firm. You should. Her eyes dropped to her tea, hiding the small, shy smile that tugged at her lips. How did he always know the right thing to say? For a while, they ate in comfortable silence. The distant clashing of foam swords and the boys' wild battle cries filled the air like the soundtrack of a childhood well lived. Every now and then, Sarah would glance at them, unable to stop the small surge of pride that filled her heart. Her boys. Her family. Her life. By the way, Alexander said, his voice pulling her out of her thoughts, I've been thinking about something. Dangerous, she quipped, taking another bite of her sandwich. Funny, he said, giving her a look of mock annoyance. No, but seriously. It's about you. Her chewing slowed, and she raised an eyebrow at him. Me? Yeah, he said, leaning forward, resting his chin on his hands like he was about to deliver something big. I've been watching you, don't look at me like that, I'm not being creepy, I mean, I've been watching how you are with the boys, with people, with everything. His voice grew softer, more thoughtful. You're a natural leader, Sarah. You walk into a room, and people just follow. She squinted at him, unsure where he was going with this. You trying to flatter me or get me to clean the garage? He laughed, his head tilting back, his eyes crinkling at the edges in that way she loved. Neither, he said, leaning in a little closer. But I'm serious. I think you've been running from something you don't need to run from. Her smile faded slightly, and she tilted her head, curious now. What do you mean? You're always talking about how you're done chasing titles, done chasing roles, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. But maybe it's not about chasing. Maybe it's about walking toward it. On your own terms. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table, her brows drawing together. Her own terms. She thought about the job offer she'd tucked away in the kitchen drawer. It had been sitting there for days, untouched. She'd told herself she was done with that kind of life. But was she? You don't have to go back to Florence to lead, he said, his eyes locked on hers. You could lead right here. Her heart tightened, her eyes shifting to the boys still playing on the lawn. He was right. She knew at the moment he said it. Leadership wasn't a title. It wasn't a job in Florence. It was her. She had been leading all along, through every fall, every doubt, every decision to keep going. Okay, she said after a long pause, her voice steady but sure. I'll think about it. Good, Alexander said, his smile slow and full of pride. That's all I'm asking. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed behind his head, his eyes on the sky as if he'd just won something. She watched him for a moment, feeling that familiar warmth again. He didn't push. He never did. He just opened the door and waited for her to walk through it. Later that night, after the boys had finally fallen asleep, Sarah sat on the living room floor with her back against the couch, papers spread out around her. The job offer was there, front and center. But next to it were sketches of something new. Ideas for a local community center. A space for kids. A space for parents. A place where people could feel seen, supported, and safe. She bit her lip, scribbling notes on the edge of one of the sketches. After-school programs. Creative arts workshops. Space for single parents. Her heart swelled as she wrote. The idea wasn't fully formed, but it was there. It was hers. Not someone else's dream. Hers. Footsteps padded softly across the floor behind her. She glanced up to see Alexander standing there, a sleepy smile on his face. Still thinking? He asked, his voice rough with sleep. Not thinking, she said, her eyes flicking back to the sketches. Her pen moved steadily, filling the paper with more notes. Leadership on my own terms. Building something? He asked, crouching down beside her. She glanced at him, her eyes bright with something fierce, something alive. "Yeah," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "Building something real." He didn't say anything. He just sat next to her, his shoulder pressed against hers. She leaned into him for a second, just long enough to know that she wasn't building alone. The house was still. The world was quiet. But for Sarah, it wasn't just another night. It was the start of something new. She didn't know where it would go, how it would turn out, or if it would even work. But she didn't need to know. For the first time, she wasn't chasing a future. She was building one. On her own terms.